Some struggle with taking a hiatus from their career, maybe to raise children or care for an elderly parent, because they're worried that once they leave, they won't be able to get back in. But for one Central Florida woman, that wasn't the case. She paused her career to be a stay-at-home mom, and today she's thriving in a new career she never dreamed possible.
I think just knowing that a decision that you make today is not defining the rest of your life and the rest of your career. I mean, I'm a perfect example of that.
Her story up next on Reinvention at Any Age. How did you end up in this kind of situation? And that changed the whole trajectory of your life. This is my light, and I'm going to let it shine. Even if it's uncomfortable, if the change is for the better, it's worth it. Don't be scared. Prepare.
Reinvention is possible. Go make it happen for you today.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Reinvention at Any Age. I'm Amy Sweezy. When something has changed so much that it appears to be entirely new, that is reinvention. My guest today has reinvented herself multiple times, from broadcast journalist to public relations professional to stay-at-home mom to freelance writer to senior vice president at a B2B media outlet. Mitra Sorrells graduated from the University of North Carolina with a focused plan for her life. But as many of us know, life doesn't always go the way we plan. And for women, especially the ones who have children, we struggle with that work-life balance and raising kids while also maintaining a career. Mitra is here today to share how she navigated through her multiple reinventions and has some advice for those of us who struggle in the same ways. Please welcome Mitra Sorrells to the podcast. Hello.
Hi, Amy. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So before we delve into your many reinventions, I want to just start with a little bit about your background. If you can just tell us, who is Mitra Sorrells? Where'd you grow up? A little bit about your family and how you ended up at UNC.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, the suburbs, Maryland and Virginia. I am the youngest child of a family of four. And, when I think back, one of the things that really sticks out to me about my childhood and into my teen years was the fact that my family, particularly my father, was a huge news junkie. So to me, it was just, of course, you stop what you're doing and you watch the news every night. And particularly because we were in the DC area, and this was something I didn't really conceptualize until I left that area later. Growing up there, and maybe even still to this day there, the national news feels just as important and relevant as watching your local news. And there's not much of a line between the two in a way. And so my father was a huge news junkie, and I think I didn't fully realize it at the time, but I very much kind of soaked it all up. And, he would come home from work, and the first thing he would do would be to go down to our basement. That was kind of our family room. And he would first watch the local news, and then he would watch Walter Cronkite on the national news. And that's what got me thinking about pursuing a career in news and in journalism.
That's awesome. My family was Peter Jennings on ABC
Yeah.
News. Every
Yeah.
night, same thing.
Yeah.
So obviously then you went to UNC, you got an undergrad degree in broadcast journalism. How hard was it to land that first job?
Oh my gosh. So hard. Or at least I felt it at the time. I realize now, compared to the path some others have had, maybe mine wasn't too bad. But, one of the things that I did when I think back on those years in college was I really did throw myself into all the opportunities that we had there to build up my experience and my understanding of what it means to be a journalist. And, that's a lot of why I chose to go to school there. Was because of their journalism program. So I wrote for the school paper. I got an internship at a local TV station, all of those things that you kind of have to do. And then it was right after the summer after I graduated college, I actually went off and kind of did something totally different. And then I came back in August and set out, and I will never forget, this was 1989. And I had kind of a flip book of like 3x5 cards. And I think it must have been a professor that had suggested this. And I had written out one card for each station that I wanted to apply to. And then I just went on a road trip. And, back then we had actual videotapes. And I went on a road trip to TV stations. And when I think I would often just call like right the day before I got to town and say, "Hey, can I just stop by and introduce myself and drop off a tape?" And sure enough, one of those worked out. And so I got my first job at a TV station in Florence, South Carolina as a reporter.
So you were really invested in this. And I know that's what we had to do in those days. We couldn't just upload our resume reel onto YouTube and ship it off via email. We had to actually go physically in person.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And it's funny when you use the word invested, I think about the fact that, it wasn't a ton, but I had to buy videotapes. I had to, do this road trip.
Mhm.
I think I stayed at some friends' houses, but there were some hotels in there. It was quite an effort.
Yes, and the
So
postage, right, of those big, heavy videotapes to send them out
yeah.
as
Yeah.
poor college students. So, this is a little bit off topic, obviously, not specifically about your reinvention, but I think it will apply in a little bit as we continue down the road here. But do you have any advice, since we're on this topic, for other, like, recent college grads, the kids who are 22 and they're just getting finished with college, they're looking to land their first job?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would actually take it even a step back from that and start with like the freshmen in college because I think, maybe by the time you're 22, some of this advice, would have been nice to know a few years earlier. So I would say, the most important thing that I would share and that I have shared with my daughters and any of their friends that were willing to listen is you've got to have meaningful work experience on that resume. Just graduating with a college degree, even with a straight A's, is just not enough anymore, no matter what the field, I think. So, just starting off, whether it's something on your campus, whether it's, a summer internship, which may or may not be paid, I think it's still worth taking something, even if it's not paid. I've seen so many people that say, well, I'm going to go be a lifeguard for the summer and get paid instead of that internship that wouldn't pay. But that is a short-sighted view, I think. So you have to kind of invest in yourself for the long term. And not only are you getting experience, you're hopefully making some relationships with some people that will then be a reference for you because that's also really, really critical for that 22-year-old that's graduating.
Yes, not what you know, but who you know, right?
Yeah, it is. It is.
So you ended up you made this big investment with money and time and education and put your whole self into it. You finally get this first TV job in Florence, South Carolina. How long did you stay in TV before you were like, I think I'm going to move into something else?"
You know some of this story, of course, because we know each other on a personal level. So I ended up in a relationship with someone who was also in television. And as we became more serious, and he moved, I believe he made the first move for his job, and then I made a move. It started to occur to me that, his career was showing a little bit more promise than mine in the world of TV. And I thought, I really don't want to be following him from market to market and taking the overnight producing job, because at that point I had become a producer. And so I started thinking this is probably when I need to start thinking about expanding, myself a little bit and doing something different. So it was, I'd have to do the math. And it was maybe 5 years or so after that first job. I was living in Columbus, Ohio, and I decided to get out of TV and took a job in more of a communications PR type role.
And would you consider that a reinvention?
It's interesting. I don't know that I did at the time, and I don't know that I even would now had have if you didn't kind of frame it that way, but I suppose it sort of was. Yeah, I was stepping in and maybe it hit me that it was more of a reinvention that I realized when I really started certainly that first job in PR and realized, I didn't have any training in public relations. And there are certain, skills and strategies and PR plans and different things that you're supposed to kind of understand to do that well. And I did not have that background. So, and we didn't have the internet capabilities that we have today. Let me also mention. So my ability to sort of self-educate was not what it might be if I was doing that today.
And at the time, were you a little bit hesitant about it because this was your dream job, or were you, just so happy to be together with Tom, who is your husband now, that at that time you're just like, it doesn't matter. I'll do any job.
Yeah, well, here again, as you know, having worked in television, it can be kind of brutal, and it can really, be draining. And so I'm not even sure by that point, even those few years in, I necessarily looked at it as my dream job anymore. I knew I really enjoyed, writing. I knew I really enjoyed trying to take kind of topics and complex ideas and make them a little bit more clear. And so, in a way, that's been a thread that has woven, I think, through everything I've done, even though I got out of television.
And at some point, you decided to stop working in your career and instead focused on being at home, raising your three children. So, talk to us a little bit about how you came to that decision and how difficult it was.
We were living in Michigan, and by the time I had my second daughter, I had cut back to working part time. I was working for an educational agency outside of Detroit, and I had a fairly long commute, and it just got to be a lot with two kids. And to be perfectly honest, um, realizing, okay, this is what I'm making as a salary, and this is what I'm paying for childcare. You start to do the math there, and that really hit me actually when I switched to part time, I should say. So I switched to part time, but I was still paying childcare for two kids, and in a way, it kind of the timing somewhat worked out because it was around the time that I was starting to think this isn't working. I've got these two small kids at home, and with my husband's schedule, he was going in very very early in the morning, and so he wasn't around then. Um, and so I thought it's probably time for me to stop working. And then right at around that time was when we made the move to Florida, and it just became kind of a natural break point to say, okay, we're going to move, and I'm just not even going to pursue work and just focus on staying home with the kids, which again, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but I think about that now. That was in 2000. What a different world now with remote work and things. I might have made a different decision if it was 2025, but
Right. Very different now. And
yeah.
when we talk about reinvention, it's really it's kind of creating a whole new you. So did you feel like when you left your career and decided to stay home, did you feel like you'd created this whole new you as a stay-at-home mom?
Here again, I'm not sure in the moment it felt that way. It truly just felt like the right thing to do. And I will say, I mean, it's funny when I think back to that time, all of my closest friends who I'm still close to today, who were all very career focused, at that point, we were probably in our late 20s. I mean, they were stunned when I said, I'm just going to stop working and stay home. But just something in my gut and, in talking it over with my husband, it just felt like the right thing to do. And, I think I certainly didn't look at it as like, okay, that's it. I'm never going to work again. Um, and there again, had there been an opportunity to do something in a remote way, I might have completely taken a different path. But at that point, especially moving here to a whole new state, a whole new city, the option was either try to find a full-time job or don't work. So,
Well, I know there'll be people that are listening to this podcast who think, well, sure, she could do that because she was married, she wasn't a single mom, and her husband had an income. But I'm sure that there were still a lot of sacrifices that you had to make. So, can you share some advice to others, either moms or dads, who would like to be home, but they feel like they can't financially make it happen?
yeah, I mean, you know what? That's a really hard question, I think, and it's a very personal one. I can simply tell you what worked for us. We made the move to Florida. We very intentionally made the decision that we would only, um, buy a house that we could afford on one salary. So there was no kind of pressure there to then supplement the income to be able to afford our lifestyle. Um, and yeah, there again, I mean, I think it just came down to thinking, okay, what might I be spending on childcare and all these things? Again, particularly because my husband's job was not a traditional 9 to 5 job. So that created some complications in itself. One of the things I think I have tried to communicate to my daughters, none of them have kids yet, but as they think about this, is, ultimately it's about kind of just making the best decision you can with what you know at the moment, right? And going from there. So
Well, and you mentioned already that when you first left and decided to stay at home full time, you didn't really think, okay, this is it. I'm never going to work again. So,
Yeah.
was it kind of in the back of your mind that someday I will return to work? And what was that conversation with yourself like?
Yeah, and, there again, especially when you at that point, I had my 3rd child, you're just busy in the day to day. I don't know how much reflection I was really doing at that time about coming up with a true strategy. I tried to keep some, like, kind of mentally stimulating activities in my life, even just, getting involved with the PTA at their school, and I think I handled some of, like, the communications for that. There were some nonprofits that I got involved in, where I was doing like volunteer PR work and that type of thing, just to, again, have a bit of an outlet. But yeah, once my youngest went to kindergarten, I believe is when it was. And so all 3 of them were in school all the time. That's when I really started to more actively pursue some work.
And what was that process like? Were you grabbing some of the things that you had from your journalism background and the PR background? And you said you enjoy writing. So, was it
Yeah.
just writing work that you were looking for?
Yeah, I started writing for some magazines. Back then, it's funny even to think how much things have changed just in the 20 years or so. But there were several magazines in the Orlando area, and there were a couple that I started doing some regular writing for. And it just felt really good, just getting back into it again. And it was kind of a nice challenge because I had not done as much of that longer form writing, magazine writing.
Can you share a little bit then about how you ended back in a full-time job? I mean, there's a lot of people who are nervous to leave their career and, moms who want to stay home, they want to raise their kids for a little bit, or maybe even it's to care for an elderly parent or just take a hiatus or whatever the reason is, maybe take a break from that full-time job if they can, but then they think that they can't get back in. So, how did you make it happen after so many years away?
Yeah, well, here again, and this is I have to attribute this to my husband, but I think it's so true. Like when I think about it now, looking in the rearview mirror, it all makes sense. It all lines up nice and clearly. Back then, I could not have mapped out this path to take me to where I am in 2025. But yeah, I ended up doing freelance writing, and then I took a part-time job with a B2B media outlet. Believe it or not, I found that job on Craigslist, um, which I don't even know if people still look for jobs on Craigslist, but this was
Maybe
maybe
it's
in
now replaced by LinkedIn, right?
yeah. Yeah, this was I think around 2007 or so, 2008, something like that. So it was a part-time job at a B2B media outlet, meaning that it was covering the meetings and events industry. And so we were writing for the meetings and events industry and for people working in that field. And that was not something I'd ever done before at a B2B outlet, not just a public-facing media outlet. But I really enjoyed that, and that was part-time, and I did that for many, many years. And, one of the interesting things that happened there, really somewhat kind of just a little happy accident, I guess you'd say, that has helped then lay the groundwork for my future was we were covering events. So I would go to the convention center and cover a lot of the big conventions and things. Orlando's a big convention town. And I was always trying to find, what's the interesting story to tell here? Just to write about a conference can be kind of boring. And I was covering the Surf Expo at the Orlando Convention Center. And I noticed that the organizers of the event were walking around with an app on their phone that was a decibel monitor because some of the exhibitors, like, I don't remember, like Vans was there, whoever's in the world of surfing and, all the different brands that touch that world, some of them would have like loud music playing and they're all trying to grab attention for the people walking around the event. So the organizers had these decibel monitors and they were going and kind of, giving a slap on the wrist to the exhibitors that were putting out too much noise because it was inhibiting the others around them. And I ended up doing a story on that. And that I really feel like that kind of sparked the idea and started this idea of covering technology. And I actually ended up going from being kind of a general reporter for this company to being the tech editor because that was also, it was a bit of fortuitous timing. That was at a time this ended up being, 2010, 2011, 2012. There was a lot of technology coming into play for the meetings and events industry, QR codes and NFC and all these concepts. And it wasn't really being covered very much.
Would you consider yourself, or at that time, like a tech nerd, or was it something that you had to learn about?
Yeah, a little bit of both, I think. I realized I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. And the funny thing, and I used to always say this, that the outlet that I wrote for is called BizBash. It still exists today. And I would always say to people, I really write more about the biz than the bash. A lot of some of my colleagues were really covering more of like the decor and the balloons and the color scheme. And I'm like, no, 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 I'm writing more about the biz than the bash. But yeah, I just really enjoyed it.
I think a lot of people maybe are hesitant to take a new job, especially if it's in a new field that they haven't done before, because they feel like they don't know anything about it or know how to learn about it. So, how were you able to learn about this new subject matter? Do you think that being excited about it was key?
Yeah, for sure. I think that was some of it. And, there again, because I could sense that there wasn't a lot of coverage of these topics, that kind of got me excited to maybe be one of the ones sort of breaking some of this news for people that had an interest across that industry. And there again, by that point, I was able to do like research online and read articles and also just talking to people, interviewing people and kind of talking to the experts in the field. So yeah, I think sometimes it becomes a bit of a snowball effect. You start something and you don't really realize, and then you get into it more. And
At your current company where you are now, you started off as a part-time writer, right? And then you snowballed into editor in chief, and now you're senior VP.
yeah, so and actually with my current company, I came on full time. It was the transition from BizBash. It was one of my colleagues at BizBash that left to go to this new media outlet that was launching in late 2017. And in talking to her, I said, "What is this?" And then that's when it was like, "Oh my gosh, wait, we need a technology reporter, but I didn't think you'd be interested in a full-time job." And I was like, "You know what? Actually, I think I am interested in full-time work at this point." So, I joined in January of 2018 as a full-time reporter, and then have kind of, moved through some different roles, as you've said.
So now senior VP of content. How long was that process
Yeah.
from 18 to now?
Yeah. So what ended up happening was I joined in 2018, and this was a brand new media outlet. So, there's kind of excitement and also, stress and frustration building something from the ground up. But we were building, and then unfortunately, the pandemic in 2020, we were only a little over 2 years old at that point, and it kind of put the brakes on for a bit. But luckily, we are a brand of a much larger company called North Star Travel Group, and luckily, they're very strong, and we kept fighting through and came out the other end. And then just this past, like late August, early September of 24, our company went through a bit of a reorganization. And I have stepped into this role now as Senior Vice President of Content.
Sometimes when companies go through a reorganization, a lot of people get let go. Did you have any fear of that, or, what would you say contributed to the fact that you were promoted into this amazing role as senior vice president?
Wow, that's probably a question for my boss, not for me. But I feel very fortunate, and I have to say, maybe to a certain extent, my lack of experience and longevity with our research division and with our events may have worked in my favor a little bit, and because they were looking for a bit of a fresh perspective.
I know at one point, and I don't know if this is still the case now that you're senior VP, but at one point, the work that you were doing included interviewing guests at trade shows. And essentially,
Yeah,
you were a news anchor or a reporter at these events.
yeah.
Would you say that your early years in college and then in TV news kind of helped prepare you for what you chose to do later in life?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And who would have known? There again, like I said, it all makes sense in the rear view, right? But all those years ago, never in a million years could I have thought, oh, in 2018, you're gonna step into this role and have to be doing these types of interviews again. But yeah, because we are a media outlet, we have the media outlet of FocusWire, and we have events that we do. At those events, we set up what we call our studio. And it truly looks like a little, mini little TV studio, and we have leaders from all across our industry that come to these events, and we use that opportunity to then interview them at the events. But it's kind of like riding a bike, as they say, and got back behind the little mini desk that we had set up and clipped on a microphone and did those interviews, and it did feel probably a million times easier than it would have had I never had that past experience.
Well, and I come from the TV world as well. And I think one of the things that so often my coworkers would say, and a lot of us being a meteorologist, we would say things like, I can't leave my job because I don't know what else I would do. I can't do anything else. I don't have the skills to do something else. And I don't think we all realize that we may already have the skills. We just may not have applied them in a different way or known how to apply them in a different way.
Yeah, no, that's very, very true. And, I think one of the interesting things for me when I think about, my career is that, I'm doing something now, a type of job that I never even knew existed, and so much of it just comes down to your frame of reference. When I first started working for a B2B media outlet, that had never occurred to me. Like all those years in journalism school and then working, I don't think anybody ever said to me, "Hey, you do understand there's a lot more than just, the CBS News and the Washington Post and these like public facing daily media outlets. There's a whole world of B2B journalism."
So, what advice do you have for younger moms or dads who are maybe contemplating stepping back for their career, maybe just temporarily, in order to spend full time at home?
I guess I would say, like a lot of things in life, I think it maybe is one of those that is not black and white. So you can sit there and think and think and I'm very guilty of this in a lot of things in my life. So it's easier to give advice than to take it sometimes. But
For sure.
it's not as if you'll just think about it more, all of a sudden in an instant, it'll be crystal clear this is the right decision and this is the wrong decision. It's probably not an either or situation. So I think at some point you do the best you can to weigh the opportunities you have in front of you and the risks and the rewards and also I think just knowing that a decision that you make today is not defining the rest of your life and the rest of your career. I mean, I'm a perfect example of that. And so you have to look at it with the long view and not a short-term view.
And do you feel that now that you have reinvented yourself, you've done many different things, that makes it easier to now plan perhaps another reinvention?
Um, yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know. Who knows, what the future may hold, I guess. One of the things that I will say that has been a kind of an unexpected benefit of all this, I think, is I do think it has been helpful and valuable for my three daughters to see my path and to understand that, it is possible to do new things later in life. I mean, I laugh thinking about it now, but when I got the promotion to be editor in chief, I remember one of my girls saying, like, "Mom, this just doesn't happen to people your age," or something. And
Your
I guess they
age.
meant it well, but you know what I mean? In other words, saying like, because it really was a big risk to a certain extent that my company was taking by giving me that job. I think it maybe does make me feel a little bit like, you know what? There may be something else down the road, and who knows? But right now, I'm just enjoying the ride.
Fantastic. Well, we've been friends for more than 20 years. I've watched your three girls grow up into these amazing, beautiful young women. And so kudos to you. And of course, Tom, your husband as well, for raising these beautiful people. And yeah, obviously, the choices that you've made have worked because that's the result, right? When we look at them and we see that they're successful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy. This is what it's all about, right?
Well, your advice has been great for me over the years because your girls are all just a little bit older than all three of mine. I've loved picking your brain over the years. If people want to know more about you or your company, where can they find you? Website?
Yes, yeah. So Focusrite. So that's a whole story as to why we spell it with a PH, but it's PHOCUSWRIGHT. Focusrite.com is our main brand and our main company. And then FocusWire, also with a PH, is the media outlet. And we are covering the travel industry. I like to say it's the travel industry at the intersection of technology.
I know that your story of reinvention is going to inspire so many others. So thank you again so much for being here.
Yep. Thank you so much for having me, Amy.
So, what about you? Were you inspired by Mitra's story? One of the best things about reinventing yourself is that there is no age limit. You can reinvent yourself a few years out of college, or after you spend time as a stay at home mom or dad, or even when you're an empty nester looking for your what's next. You can reinvent yourself multiple times throughout your life, too. Don't let our ageist society convince you that it's too late or you're too old. Whether you want to reinvent yourself or you have to reinvent yourself, remember, reinvention is possible. Go make it happen for you today.